In an age often remembered for its soaring cathedrals and profound piety, a different world existed just beneath the surface, one teeming with rituals that defy our modern understanding. Imagine, if you will, monks and nuns seeking a strange, disembodied form of intimacy through holes meticulously carved in the stone walls that separated them, all in a twisted pursuit of technical purity. Picture a wife, desperate to keep her husband's affection, secretly stirring a few drops of her own menstrual blood into his evening wine, a potent folk magic whispered from one generation to the next. And consider the solemn, bizarre ceremonies where living people were ritually married to animals, not out of love, but in a desperate attempt to cast out a perceived inner demon. These are not tales spun from fantasy, they are the documented, lived realities of medieval Europe. We are about to journey into a time when human desire, stifled and suffocated by rigid doctrine and pervasive superstition, refused to be extinguished. Instead, it erupted, overflowing the banks of propriety in the most peculiar and astonishing ways. The Church, in its quest to regulate every aspect of human life from the cradle to the grave, inadvertently created a pressure cooker of repression where the most natural of impulses were forced into strange, distorted shapes. This is the story of that sacred anxiety. So, before we step into that strange darkness together, take a moment to get comfortable, dim the lights, let the quiet of the room settle around you, and prepare to explore the unsettling and deeply human shadows of the past. If you believe your dreams to be a private sanctuary, a harmless theatre of the mind, you would not have fared well in medieval Europe. In many corners of the continent, particularly where the Church's influence was a suffocating blanket, the nocturnal wanderings of your subconscious could be used to condemn you. Theologians like Augustine and Thomas Aquinas wrote extensively on the nature of demons, giving credence to the idea that the soul was vulnerable during sleep. It was a world where women were hauled before religious authorities, accused of having carnal relations with invisible, demonic entities, a charge that was treated not as a symptom of a troubled mind or a vivid imagination, but as a grave religious offense, a treason against God himself. These terrifying accusations rarely stemmed from concrete proof. They were born from whispers in the marketplace and confessions extracted under immense psychological pressure. A woman's fate could be sealed by the slightest deviation from the norm. Did she speak out of turn, possess an unusual knowledge of herbal remedies, or simply prefer her own company? Any of these could be twisted into evidence of a sinister nocturnal life. The threshold for launching a formal investigation was perilously low, requiring nothing more than a recounted nightmare, a sudden unexplained illness, or the simple, damnable fact of a woman living alone and outside the direct control of a man. This pervasive fear was not accidental, it was cultivated. The Church actively promoted a terrifying narrative of spiritual warfare, giving names and forms to the demons that haunted the night. They spoke of the incubus, a male demon believed to prey on women, and the succubus, its female counterpart who seduced men, often to steal their seed for diabolical purposes. These entities were not mere folkloric boogeymen, they were presented as a real and constant threat, supernatural predators that could slip into any bedroom, take on a human form or remain terrifyingly invisible, and violate their victims in their sleep. The primary targets of these tales were women, young, married, widowed, and even nuns, whose sexuality was viewed as a dangerous gateway for demonic influence. The stories of these spectral violations gained a horrifying authority as the Church began to systematically collect and circulate written testimonies from across the Christian world. The accounts, though varied, often shared a chillingly familiar set of details. Victims described the sensation of a heavy, shadowy presence pressing down on them, pinning them to their beds, leaving them unable to move or scream for help. While we would now recognize these as classic symptoms of sleep paralysis, a state where the mind wakes up before the body, the medieval world had a different, more sinister explanation. Instead of seeking a physician to discuss the body's humors or an overactive imagination, They called for the priest and lit the torches, ready to hunt the devil in their Medist. Once a woman was formally accused, she was thrust into an interrogation designed to prove her guilt, not to uncover the truth. She was trapped in a terrifying catch-22, a maze of questions from which there was no escape. If she refused to answer, her silence was interpreted as defiant resistance, a clear sign of a soul in league with evil. If she tried to cooperate by providing details of her dream, or a description of the supposed being, her answers were twisted into evidence of collaboration, proof that she had willingly engaged with the demon. For these unfortunate women, there was simply no safe ground to stand on. Faced with relentless questioning and the threat of torture, it is no surprise that many women confessed. Some simply gave in to end the ordeal, their spirits broken by months of imprisonment and fear. They would eventually tell the inquisitors exactly what they wanted to hear, providing lurid, detailed descriptions of the demon's appearance, its actions, and the unholy feelings it stirred within them. These coerced statements were then meticulously recorded in official documents, not as the product of duress, but as irrefutable proof of guilt. For the Church, these confessions were invaluable propaganda, a powerful tool to demonstrate that evil was not an abstract concept but a tangible, ever-present threat in the daily lives of the faithful. The court of public opinion was often just as merciless as the official inquisitors. These trials became grim spectacles, drawing curious crowds eager to hear every salacious detail of the sins that had been committed in their community. Gossip ran rampant, with each retelling of the woman's alleged crimes adding new, more fantastical layers to the story. Neighbors, perhaps holding a grudge or simply caught up in the hysteria, would come forward with their own evidence, claiming to have heard strange noises from the accused's home at night, or to have seen shadowy figures near her window. Any woman who was already an outsider, for being too outspoken, for living alone, or for having a poor relationship with her neighbors, became a dangerously icy target. Once a conviction was secured, the punishments were designed to be a brutal and public lesson. The goal was not rehabilitation, but the complete removal of the source of corruption from the community. Some women were sentenced to a living death, forced into the strict and silent confines of a cloister for the remainder of their lives, their existence erased from the outside world. Others faced the deeply personal violence of public humiliation, paraded through the streets to be mocked and jeered at by their former neighbors. While the image of burning at the stake looms large in our imagination, execution could take many forms. Some women were drowned in rivers, while others were simply left to rot and die of disease in squalid prisons. Let us be clear, this was never truly about religion, it was about power. The obsessive policing of dreams and desires was a brutally effective method of control. Through these trials, the Church sought to regulate not just the public behavior of its flock, but their innermost thoughts, fears, and fantasies. A woman who spoke of sexuality, even in the context of a terrifying nightmare, was considered a threat to the established order. She served as a living reminder that desire existed outside the sanctioned, controlled structure of marriage and procreation. And so they turned her into a warning, her story read aloud in sermons, and recorded in confessors' manuals as a cautionary tale for all other women who might dare to have a voice. The long-term effect of this campaign of fear was the creation of a profound and suffocating silence around the topic of sexuality, especially female sexuality. Generations of women were taught to feel a deep and abiding shame about their own bodies, their natural instincts, and their private thoughts. They learned to avoid speaking about anything personal, even amongst themselves, for fear that their words could be twisted and used against them. This cultivated isolation made them even more vulnerable. A single restless night, a muttered word in one's sleep, or a half-remembered dream could be all it took to lose one's reputation, one's freedom, and ultimately, one's life. What is perhaps most unsettling is the terrifying certainty with which this system operated. There was no room for skepticism, no space for alternative explanations. Fear effortlessly hardened into fact. A simple dream, once spoken aloud, became a confession. That confession, often coerced, became the centerpiece of a trial, and that trial, with its predetermined outcome, inevitably became a death sentence. The idea of demonic sex fit perfectly into the church's established worldview, serving as undeniable proof that the devil was not a metaphor, but a real adversary, and that women, with their supposedly weak and unstable bodies, were his preferred gateway into the mortal world. The official records from these trials, many of which still exist in libraries and archives today, are chilling in their cold, bureaucratic precision. Written in rigid, meticulous script, they are filled with long, clinical descriptions of the accused women. The scribes sometimes noted a trembling hand or the glisten of tears on a cheek, but these observations were recorded as signs of guilt, not of terror. Nowhere in these countless pages is there a single moment of compassion or a hint that these women were seen as people in need of help. They were simply labeled as sinners, their humanity erased by the very system that claimed to be saving their souls. The stain of such an accusation was indelible, spreading to the woman's entire family, who were often publicly shamed or forced to pay heavy fines. Even after the woman was imprisoned or executed, her name remained synonymous with demonic corruption. In the exceedingly rare instance that a woman was acquitted, her life was still effectively over. Being accused was enough. Friends would turn away on the street, business would dry up, and no one would dare associate with a person who had once been suspected of being a consort of demons. The fear was a poison that seeped into the very fabric of daily life, turning communities against their own. This institutionalized terror had a chilling effect on private life. Across the continent, parents began to warn their daughters to stay silent about what they experienced at night. Wives learned to keep strange dreams to themselves, lest their husbands report them to the priest. Even the simple, unconscious act of touching oneself while asleep could be twisted by a suspicious observer into something criminal and diabolical. This was not justice. It was fear wearing a holy robe and carrying a book of law. It was a system built on suspicion and control, one that turned the universal human experience of desire into a punishable crime and the sanctuary of sleep into a potential crime scene. Having explored the dark realm of punished desires, our journey now takes a curious turn. From a world where sexual thoughts were seen as evidence of demonic possession, we will step into the strange domain of medieval remedies and folk medicine. Here, in a bizarre twist of logic, sexual release was not always forbidden. For women who were given the ambiguous and convenient label of hysterical, it was sometimes prescribed as a cure, proving that the medieval mind had many strange ways of managing the eternal problem of human desire. In some corners of medieval Europe, when a relationship grew cold and passion needed to be rekindled, people didn't turn to whispered words of love or thoughtful gifts. Instead, their solutions were far more primal and visceral. They turned to the local butcher, or perhaps to their own backyard, for the tools of affection. The hearts, livers, testicles, and kidneys of animals became potent instruments in the subtle art of seduction and control. These were not used in a symbolic sense, like a Valentine's heart. They were actual, physical objects, believed to be imbued with a raw, magical power that could directly influence a person's heart and mind. This strange form of folk magic was particularly common among women who felt their domestic power slipping away, who feared their husbands were growing distant or seeking comfort in another's bed. In a society that offered them few legitimate avenues to voice their insecurities or solve their marital problems, these charms became a secret and desperate recourse. If a man became cold and withdrawn, it was not unheard of for his wife to procure the heart of a frog, dry it until it was as hard as a stone, and slip it under the mattress on his side of the bed, hoping its essence would reawaken his affections. The grim pharmacopoeia of love did not end with frog hearts. Each animal part was believed to carry a specific and powerful energy. Some women would secretly obtain the liver of a rooster, a creature known for its virility, and hide it in the home, believing its essence would transfer a masculine heat and vitality back into their husband. Others swore by an even more direct approach, using the dried and preserved testicles of a goat, an animal notorious for its insatiable lust. These would be carefully tied into a small cloth pouch and hidden away, a potent charm meant to restore the lost fire and fertility to their marital life. The practicalities of this desperate magic were as grim as its ingredients. These potent tokens of affection had to be hidden with meticulous care, tucked away in the most private corners of a medieval home. A woman might sew a dried organ into the straw-stuffed ticking of her husband's pillow, or bury it beneath a loose floorboard he trod upon daily, hoping the charm's influence would seep into him with every step. But secrecy was a constant battle against the forces of nature. These animal parts, even when dried, were rarely preserved perfectly. In the damp, close air of a wattle and daub house, a faint, sweetish odour of decay would inevitably begin to permeate the room, a constant anxiety-inducing clue that threatened to betray the woman's secret and bring disastrous consequences down upon her head. Should a husband, a prying mother-in-law, or a rival discover one of these hidden bundles, the interpretation was rarely charitable. This was not seen as a sad attempt to mend a failing marriage. It was immediately branded as malevolent sorcery. In an instant, a domestic drama could escalate into a full-blown accusation of witchcraft, a charge that carried the weight of damnation. It reveals a fascinating and deeply unsettling paradox of the medieval mind, a society that lived in mortal fear of the devil, and his minions could simultaneously see no issue with hiding the desiccated testicles of a goat in the marital bed. The line between acceptable folk belief and diabolical heresy was dangerously thin, and it was almost always the woman who found herself on the wrong side of it. These practices did not simply spring from desperation. They were the lingering ghosts of much older traditions. Long before the Church spread its monolithic doctrine across Europe, pagan and folk beliefs tied human fate directly to the natural world, seeing potent spiritual energy in blood, bone and flesh. These ancient rituals were never fully stamped out. They simply went underground, surviving quietly in rural communities, especially among the poor and marginalized who had little access to the formal systems of medicine or the ear of a priest. A village woman, facing the potential ruin of her husband's infidelity, could not afford a physician's diagnosis for his wandering eye, but she could obtain a rooster, boil its liver, and place her faith in a ritual that felt tangible and within her control. This network of forbidden knowledge operated as a quiet, clandestine economy run by and for women. The secrets of which herbs to use, which animal parts were most potent, and which words to whisper were passed down through generations, a fragile inheritance of female power in a world that granted them none. It was a world of hushed tones and cautious glances, as women feared not only the judgment of the church but also the jealousy of their neighbours. A successful charm could inspire envy, and in some cases, the same village healer who provided a woman with a love potion might be paid by a rival to craft a counter-charm, creating a silent, invisible war of magic waged in the heart of the community. The selection of these gruesome ingredients was anything but random. It was guided by a rich and deeply ingrained system of animal symbolism. Each part was chosen for the specific quality it was believed to impart. An unlaid egg, for instance, might be used to represent an unfilled desire that the charm was meant to complete. The heart of a frog, a creature known for its sticky tongue and clinging nature, was thought to instill a love that would hold fast and never let go. And the testicles of a goat were chosen not merely for their obvious shape, but because the goat itself was an infamous symbol of unrestrained lust and virility, an energy the woman hoped to redirect exclusively toward herself. The men in these situations were not always oblivious victims. Some, particularly those who were indeed unfaithful, became adept at using these folk beliefs to their own advantage. Upon returning home, a husband might theatrically claim to smell a charm, using the supposed witchcraft as a pre-written excuse for his own transgressions. It became a convenient way to deflect blame. In surviving church records, one can find cases where a man confesses not to his own adultery, but to his wife's alleged sorcery, presenting a tattered bundle of herbs and dried meat as evidence of her sin. And in a legal and religious system that inherently valued a man's word over a woman's, the church authorities were often all too eager to take the husband's side. When a woman was caught, she was rarely afforded the opportunity to explain her desperation. The simple discovery of a piece of dried animal tissue in her personal belongings was often enough to condemn her. The punishments varied in their severity, but were always designed to enforce submission. In less serious cases, she might face public humiliation, her head shaved to mark her as a sinner, or being formally barred from attending church services. But if the charm was linked, however tenuously, to a subsequent illness or death in the community, the accusation could quickly escalate to witchcraft. In that case, the woman who had only sought to protect her home could find her own life at risk, facing imprisonment, torture, or execution. And yet, despite the ever-present danger and the unsavory nature of the charms themselves, these practices endured. They were too deeply woven into the fabric of daily life to be easily eradicated by clerical threats. This knowledge was preserved not in official books, but in the margins of herbal remedy guides, in whispered conversations between cousins over the hearth, and in the oral traditions passed from mother to daughter. The cloying, musty smell of these charms, often unsuccessfully masked by lavender or sage, lingered in the damp, smoky air of peasant homes. A testament to a secret, resilient tradition that refused to die, even under the constant threat of discovery and punishment. The perceived success of these charms was a fragile and subjective thing. A husband who noticed the strange bundle under his bed might choose to say nothing, especially if the charm appeared to be working. If his fortunes improved or his passions returned, he might accept the strange magic as a part of his domestic reality. But this tacit acceptance was conditional. The very moment something went wrong, a bout of impotence, a nightmare, a sick child, that same charm would instantly become the scapegoat. In a world rife with uncertainty, it was far easier to blame a piece of dried chicken liver for one's problems than to confront the messy, complicated, and often painful realities of a human relationship. Looking back, it is impossible not to feel a profound sense of sadness for the women who felt compelled to rely on what was essentially rotten meat to find some measure of security in their own homes. The vast majority were not attempting to curse or harm anyone. They were simply longing for the basic human needs of affection, loyalty, and a little bit of attention from the person they were bound to. But they lived in a world that gave them precious few tools to achieve this. So they turned to what they had: the fragmented memories of ancient rituals, a few bits of bone and sinew, and a desperate, whispered wish for a better, more stable life. In the rigid moral landscape of the medieval era, control over one's own body was a luxury few could afford. Even the most solitary and private of actions were subject to intense scrutiny and the threat of severe punishment, and no act was more heavily policed than masturbation. The Church, in its effort to regulate all aspects of sexuality, declared that male self-pleasure was not a minor personal failing, but a spiritual crime of the highest order, drawing from the biblical story of Onan, who spilled his seed upon the ground. Theologians argued that any release of semen outside the explicit, sanctioned purpose of procreation was a grave sigh, a wasteful act that defied God's command to be fruitful and multiply. This was not mere rhetoric. The Church taught that every single drop of semen contained the potential for thousands of human lives, complete with souls. Therefore, to spill that precious fluid for any reason other than attempting to create a child was framed, quite literally, as the murder of the unborn. This terrifying doctrine was not treated as a metaphor. It was written into canon law, preached with thundering conviction from the pulpit, and treated as a serious, prosecutable offense in religious courts. transforming a natural human impulse into an act of mass homicide. The psychological weight of this belief on medieval men is difficult to overstate. This doctrine of spiritual conservation shaped the daily routines of religious life, especially within the austere walls of monasteries. Young boys and novices entering the service of the church were immediately and frequently warned about the eternal dangers of touching themselves, taught that even a fleeting lustful thought could invite demonic influence and lead to damnation. The entire monastic environment was engineered to prevent temptation. Beds were deliberately made hard and uncomfortable. Blankets were thin to prevent warmth and comfort, and baths were taken quickly in cold water to shock the body out of any sense of ease. Hands, the primary instruments of this sin, were often required to be kept outside the blankets and visible at all times, even during sleep. Of course, the body has its own rhythms that do not obey the rules of men. When a young monk inevitably experienced a nocturnal emission, it was almost never dismissed as a natural biological event. Instead, it was treated as undeniable evidence that he had been harboring sinful, lustful thoughts during his waking hours. Even if he could not remember them, he would be subjected to intense questioning by his abbot, scolded for his lack of spiritual discipline, and assigned penance that could range from days of fasting on bread and water to hours spent praying for forgiveness on the cold, unforgiving stone floors of the chapel. It is easy for us to find this level of biological policing absurd, a system where a natural bodily function was treated with the same gravity as witchcraft. But for the young men who lived under this constant surveillance, it was a source of profound and relentless terror. The obsession with semen as a vital life force, a belief with roots in ancient medical theories, was pushed to its most extreme conclusion during this period. It was thought that wasting this precious fluid didn't just endanger unborn souls, it physically and spiritually weakened the man himself, making him more susceptible to disease and demonic possession. Confessional handbooks from the era, such as the famous Penitential by Burchard of Worms, provided priests with detailed lists of questions to ask about this sin and the corresponding penalties. A man who admitted to the act could face ritual beatings, the humiliation of having his head shaved, or be required to pay substantial fines to the church. The shame was a key component of the punishment. The goal was not simply to stop the act itself, but to burn the memory of being caught so deeply into the man's psyche that the fear of a repeat humiliation would be enough to curb any future temptation. This invasive system of control reached far beyond the monastery walls and into the supposed privacy of the family home. Devout parents, terrified for their sons' souls, kept a vigilant watch. It was not uncommon for siblings to share a bed, not for warmth or comfort, but as a form of mutual surveillance to ensure no one strayed in the night. A boy who spent too much time alone was viewed with suspicion, and even the placement of his hands during sleep could be noted and questioned. If stains were discovered on his bedding, they would be treated not as a laundry problem, but as physical evidence of a spiritual crime, to be presented to the local priest for judgment. The conversation that followed would be a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The young man would be told in no uncertain terms that his selfish, momentary pleasure had resulted in the deaths of countless souls that could have grown up to become saints, scholars, or even popes. He would be informed that his weakness had compromised not only his own spirit, but had opened a door through which the devil could enter his family's home. Above all, he would be reminded that even in the deepest darkness of his private room, the all-seeing eye of God was upon him, watching and judging his every move. This constant surveillance, both real and divine, created a deep and lasting silence around the most natural functions of the body. While the most severe condemnations were reserved for men, women were not entirely exempt from this scrutiny. A woman who showed what was considered an unhealthy interest in her own body, or who was seen spending too much time in solitude, could also be brought in for questioning by religious authorities. The lives of female saints were often presented as models of virtuous self-denial, with tales praising those who went to extreme lengths to avoid temptation. There were celebrated stories of holy women who would purposefully injure themselves or even commit acts of self-disfigurement, all out of a terrifying fear that their natural beauty might arouse sinful desire in themselves or others. The message, for both men and women, was brutally clear. True holiness required pain, denial, and a deep-seated fear of the body's own nature. This toxic fusion of morality and biology meant that legitimate medical issues were frequently misinterpreted as signs of spiritual corruption. A man who developed a rash or swelling in his genital area might be told it was God's punishment for acts of impurity he had committed in secret. A woman suffering from what we might now diagnose as anxiety or a hormonal imbalance could be accused of indulging in secret lustful thoughts. Her physical symptoms presented as an outward manifestation of her inner sin. The focus was never on treating the body with care or compassion. Instead, the primary goal was to punish the will and force a confession, confirming the person's guilt rather than facilitating their recovery. This relentless policing of the body seems to reveal far more about the institution's own anxieties than any genuine concern for the souls of its flock. At its core, this was a manifestation of a deep-seated fear of losing authority. The Church sought to impose a divine and rigid order upon the messy, unpredictable chaos of human nature. Anything that could not be easily categorized, controlled, or predicted, especially the powerful and spontaneous nature of desire, was seen as a threat that had to be eliminated. The confessional manuals from the period, with their exhaustive lists of questions and prescribed penances, treated the human body like a faulty vessel, a leaky container that was always at risk of spilling sin out into the world, and had to be constantly monitored and repaired. The psychological scars left by this system ran deep, shaping the European psyche for generations to come. The constant fear of judgment was passed down quietly, sewn into bedtime warnings, and tucked into the silences between a husband and wife. Boys grew into men who fundamentally distrusted their own natural impulses, viewing their bodies as battlefields of temptation. Girls grew into women who were taught that their very physicality was a dangerous liability, a source of sin to be hidden and controlled. In this world, the body never truly belonged to the self. It was the property of a larger system that watched, judged, and punished from every direction, creating habits of shame that would long outlive the specific rules that created them. After so much focus on punishing the private urges of men, the medieval world turned its judgmental gaze with even greater intensity toward the women who dared to seek their own satisfaction. Unlike their male counterparts, for whom desire was a sin to be managed, women were expected to feel nothing at all. The concept of female pleasure was framed as something inherently unnatural, a corrupting influence that was only permissible if it served a husband's needs, or led directly to the sacred duty of childbirth. Any desire that existed outside of these narrow, sanctioned purposes was immediately suspect, often labeled as a symptom of demonic influence or a dangerous moral failing. And yet, despite the suffocating rules and constant, thunderous warnings from the pulpit, some women found quiet, clandestine ways to experience pleasure on their own terms. This impulse led to the secret creation and use of rudimentary dildos, objects crafted from the humble and sometimes strange materials of daily life. Some were painstakingly carved from smooth pieces of wood, polished with oil until they were soft to the touch. Others were fashioned from the cleaned and filed bones of animals, shaped into simple, phallic forms. These were not items to be bought or sold in the open market. They were handmade in secret or traded discreetly, passed from one woman to another with nervous hands and whispered advice. The women who sought out and owned these forbidden objects were not the licentious sinners of the Church's imagination. They were often figures of quiet desperation and profound loneliness, widows, long cut off from the intimacy of marriage but still alive in body and mind, unmarried women with no acceptable outlet for their desires, and even nuns, Cloistered away behind vows of chastity, they may not have freely chosen. Some were married women, trapped in cold and unsatisfying unions. For them, these simple tools were not instruments of rebellion, but of simple, human affirmation. The pleasure they found in those stolen moments was a way of feeling present in their own skin, a reminder that their bodies could still feel, still respond, still be alive. To possess such an object, however, was to live with a dangerous secret. Discovery meant ruin. If a carved piece of wood was found in a woman's belongings, it could instantly lead to the most terrifying accusations of the age: witchcraft, demonic possession, or, as some court records dryly termed it, intercourse with unnatural instruments. Penitentials, like the one written by Burchard of Worms, included direct questions for confessors to ask women about using such devices. This forced women to become masters of concealment, hiding these objects in the most unlikely of places. Soon into the thick lining of a winter cloak, tucked beneath a loose floorboard, or even concealed within the hollowed-out pages of a religious book. When one of these objects was inevitably discovered, perhaps by a nosy servant, a suspicious relative, or in the settling of affairs after a sudden death, the private became brutally public. The item would be seized and brought before a court of male clerics, who would examine and describe it in humiliatingly precise detail. One can only imagine the mortifying silence of a courtroom as a group of celibate men solemnly debated the curvature and purpose of a carved stick. The woman would be subjected to a relentless and unwinnable interrogation. Why did she have it? Who taught her to use it? Denial was seen as a lie, but a confession was an admission of a sin so profound it invited the harshest punishments. The punishments handed down depended heavily on the woman's social standing and the whims of the local clergy, but they were always severe. A respected widow might be spared physical harm, but condemned to a lifetime of prayer and public penance, her reputation forever shattered. A nun would be stripped of her habit and exiled from her convent in disgrace. A poor peasant woman, however, could expect a much harsher fate, facing a public flogging or being locked away in a cell. The object itself was almost always destroyed in a symbolic public ritual, typically burned in the town square as a form of moral cleansing, and as a powerful, terrifying warning to all other women to stay within their prescribed rows. In the eyes of the church, these acts of solitary pleasure were not merely sins of the flesh, they were a fundamental challenge to the divine and patriarchal order of the world. A woman who took pleasure into her own hands, without the involvement or permission of a man, was seen as deeply dangerous. She subverted the core belief that female desire should only ever be a passive and responsive force, entirely controlled by men. By acting alone, she was claiming a radical authority over her own body, and it was this assertion of autonomy, more than the physical act or the object itself, that so profoundly frightened and enraged the moral authorities of the time. This fear quickly became codified into religious doctrine. Influential church leaders wrote damning texts arguing that women who used such tools of impurity were especially vulnerable to demonic temptation, claiming the artificial instruments would open a gateway for further, more diabolical sins. In the detailed manuals written to guide priests in the art of confession, a new category of offense began to appear, listed with chilling gravity alongside more familiar transgressions like adultery and fornication. The simple act of seeking private comfort became a formalized, recognized sin that confessors were now trained to actively investigate and root out. Despite the immense risks and the constant threat of condemnation, the practice never entirely disappeared. The simple, human need that drove it was too powerful to be legislated or shamed out of existence. Women continued to create, use, and hide these objects in a persistent, quiet act of resistance. In some families, they were passed down discreetly from mother to daughter along with other, more conventional heirlooms. Sometimes they were cleverly disguised as common household items, like a tool for weaving or a pestle for grinding herbs. In the end, many were buried with their owners, tucked into the folds of a burial gown by a loyal friend, their secrets kept safe even in death. It is a profound mistake to view these women as rebellious or immoral in the way their society did. They were simply human beings, navigating an oppressive world and trying to find a small moment of peace, a fleeting connection to their own bodies. They were not attempting to offend the church or wage a war against society. They were trying to remember what it felt like to be whole in a world that systematically punished women for thinking, speaking, and even dreaming too freely. In that context, the simple act of holding a carved piece of wood became a silent, powerful declaration of one's own existence. In the margins of this history, a few rare texts hint at a more compassionate, alternative view. A handful of midwives and female folk healers, operating outside the rigid doctrines of the church, acknowledged the practice and saw little harm in it. One or two even suggested it might be a useful remedy for what they termed a cold one, or the melancholy of the flesh. But these were marginalized voices, easily drowned out by the louder, more powerful chorus calling for purity, obedience, and punishment. For the vast majority of women, the safest choice was to keep their secrets hidden in cloth and shadow, their thoughts behind closed lips, hoping no one would ever look too closely at what was stored beneath the bed. It is difficult not to be struck by the profound and disturbing irony of a society that seemed to fear pleasure more than it feared violence. In the medieval world, a woman could be legally beaten by her husband, ostracized for speaking her mind, or imprisoned for the crime of surviving on her own. Yet, if that same woman managed to find a moment of private comfort and release, carved from a fallen branch, that act was treated with the gravity of heresy. This stark contrast reveals a deep-seated fear of female autonomy, a fear that shaped every law, every sermon, and every whispered warning of the age. After the hidden objects of wood and bone were stowed away, medieval women still found new and subtle ways to exert their influence. When direct touch was forbidden and pleasure was punished, other senses took on a heightened, almost magical significance. Among these, the sense of smell became one of the most powerful and mysterious tools in a woman's arsenal. In an era largely devoid of perfumes and soaps, the most potent scents were those that came from the body itself, sweat, breath, and the natural oils of the skin. In the pragmatic world of brothels and poor households, these traces were not seen as something to be washed away. They were seen as resources to be collected and used. This practice was especially refined by women who worked in the sex trade, whose very survival depended on their ability to attract and retain clients. Through keen observation, they began to notice a pattern. A man who lingered longer, paid more, or returned more frequently was often captivated by something beyond mere looks or words. It was something in the air, the lingering heat of the encounter, the faint trace of his own scent left behind in the room, that seemed to call him back. And so, these resourceful women began to collect what was left behind: a crumpled linen rag, a damp shirt corner, or a discarded handkerchief became valuable tools of the trade. One of the most common methods was breathtakingly simple. After a man had departed, a woman would take the cloth that had absorbed his sweat and carefully hide it, perhaps under her own mattress or inside her pillowcase. The belief was that his scent permeating her personal space would create a subconscious bond, drawing him back to her. Some women took it a step further, keeping the cloth tucked in their blouse, allowing the man's scent to mingle with her own. During his next visit, she might subtly dab the scent on her neck or wrists, a faint, almost unnoticeable reminder of their previous encounter, designed to stir his memory and desire. More elaborate rituals evolved from this basic practice. Some women believed they could create a more powerful bond by literally absorbing a man's essence. Sweat would be carefully collected by pressing a damp cloth into a bowl, squeezing out every last drop. This liquid would then be poured into a wooden tub of bath water, often along with herbs or oils. The goal was to soak in what was left of him, to absorb not just his scent, but what they referred to as his heat or spirit. It's easy to smile at the idea of turning a man's body odor into a beauty treatment, but to these women, it was a serious and potent form of magic. This intimate use of scent was not confined to the walls of the brothel. The practice seeped into the domestic lives of ordinary married women, particularly those whose husbands travelled frequently or had grown emotionally distant. A wife might take her husband's sweat-soaked undershirt, boil it in water, and then store that water in a sealed jar. This infused water could then be used for a multitude of purposes: to wash her own undergarments, to wipe down the furniture near their bed, or even as a base for a ritual bath. The strong connection between scent and memory was intuitively understood, and it was hoped that surrounding a man with his own essence would restore his affection and keep him tethered to the home. The church, unsurprisingly, took a dim view of such practices. In the eyes of religious authorities, sweat was a byproduct of the fallen, corruptible body, something to be cleansed and removed, not treasured and utilized. To use it as a tool to influence another person's emotions or actions was considered a dangerous form of manipulation, a folk magic that bordered on the sinful. Sermons would occasionally warn against the use of bodily fluids in charms and temptations, but these abstract condemnations rarely penetrated the desperate, pragmatic world where these rituals were born out of a fundamental need for security and control. Personally, I believe these practices reveal an intelligence and courage for which these women are rarely given credit. In a world that systematically denied them formal education, legal rights, and a public voice, they developed their own unique science, a subtle, intuitive understanding of human nature based on careful observation. They did not wield swords or write laws. Their tools were the mundane objects of domestic life. They worked quietly, folding cloth, saving jars, and soaking hands, but behind these simple actions was a careful, strategic mind. In a society that offered them almost no control, they found these small, beat-potent ways to shape their own outcomes, a quiet testament to their resilience and ingenuity. A careful, almost scientific logic governed the collection and use of these scented cloths. These women understood that the potency of a man's essence was at its peak in the immediate aftermath of climax, a moment when his vital heat was most powerfully expressed. They also developed crude but effective methods of preservation, storing the charged fabric in clay pots sealed with beeswax or in locked wooden chests, hoping to prevent the volatile spirit from evaporating into the air. This was a craft honed through trial and error and passed through a network of shared female wisdom, a secret knowledge that existed entirely outside the world of male-dominated scholarship. This practice, while difficult to detect, was fraught with danger. If a woman was discovered to be using a man's sweat to influence his affections, she was not seen as a desperate partner, but as a manipulative sorceress. The charge would be a low form of witchcraft, but a serious one nonetheless, especially if the man in question had recently fallen ill or begun to behave strangely, in an age when any unexplained ailment could be blamed on black magic. The discovery of such a personal and potent ingredient in a woman's possession could easily be twisted into proof of a malicious curse, transforming a secret ritual of connection into a public trial for her very life. The legacy of this practice is as ephemeral as the scents themselves. It left behind no enduring artifacts, no preserved jars in museums, no carefully labeled cloths in archives. Its history is written on water and air, surviving only in the scattered, often hostile, accounts found in confessional records and the allegorical warnings of folk tales. It is a powerful reminder that the lives of so many women in history were lived in these quiet, undocumented spaces. What we might carelessly throw away today, a piece of used cloth, a drop of sweat, a smell lingering in a room, was once imbued with profound meaning, a fragile thread of connection for women who often had little else to hold on to. By the time the scent had faded from the sheets and suspicion had poisoned the air, another, even stranger practice was taking shape, this time emerging from the murky intersection of medicine and folk healing. In medieval Europe, where knowledge of the human body was a tapestry of ancient theories and raw superstition. Unusual symptoms were often met with even more unusual treatments. One of the most pervasive and misunderstood conditions of the time was what physicians, drawing from ancient Greek texts, called hysteria. This was a vague, catch-all term applied almost exclusively to women, used to describe everything from anxiety and insomnia to emotional outbursts and seizures. Many healers of the period believed that hysteria originated in the womb, or hyster in Greek, from which the condition got its name. They clung to the ancient theory of the wandering womb, which posited that the uterus was a distinct, almost animal-like entity within a woman's body. It was believed that if the womb became dry or lonely from a lack of sexual intimacy, it would become light and travel upward through the body in search of moisture, pressing against other organs and causing suffocation, madness, and all manner of erratic behavior. While some medieval thinkers began to attribute these symptoms to demonic possession, the older, physical explanation of a restless organ remained a powerful diagnostic tool. This deeply flawed understanding of female anatomy led to a treatment that, from our modern perspective, sounds more like abuse than medicine. For married women suffering from hysterical symptoms, the prescription was straightforward. They were to engage in more frequent sexual activity with their husbands, regardless of their own desire, to moisten and pacify the womb. For unmarried women and widows, however, the situation was far more complicated. They were caught in a terrible paradox, as the very act prescribed as a cure for their ailment was the one most strictly forbidden to them by the church and society. This paradox created an opening for folk healers, who were often men, to offer a more direct and unsettling solution, what they termed therapeutic touch. The procedure was framed not as a sexual act, but as a clinical, medical treatment. It involved the healer manually stimulating the woman's genitals until she experienced what was described as a hysterical paroxysm, or a release. This was believed to ease the dangerous pressure that had built up in the womb, release a buildup of harmful humors, and coax the wandering organ back down to its proper place in the body, thereby calming the woman's agitated nerves. Some midwives, women who possessed a more practical, hands-on knowledge of the female body, also adopted this method, especially for patients suffering from persistent tension or menstrual irregularities. The treatment was almost always conducted in private, away from the prying eyes of the community. However, it was rarely administered with consent in the way we understand it today. A woman was often brought for treatment by her husband or father, and the cure was something that was done to her. It is an uncomfortable and haunting thought to consider how many women were subjected to this intimate violation in the name of healing, when all they truly wanted was to be left alone. As time went on, the process was sometimes expedited by the introduction of simple tools designed to make the healer's job easier. These were not the sophisticated vibrators of a later era, but crude devices, often made of wood or leather and operated by hand, that used pressure or pounding to induce the required release. These instruments were not common, but they were kept and used in certain healing houses and even some brothels under the guise of medicine. The success of the treatment was judged solely by its outcome. If the woman stopped her disruptive behavior, if she ceased her crying or screaming, then the cure was deemed a success, with no consideration given to her own experience of the procedure. This practice was never formally sanctioned by the church, but it was often tolerated through a kind of pragmatic silence. In many places, local religious leaders were far more concerned with maintaining social order than with the specific methods used to achieve it. If a woman's hysteria was causing a public disturbance or disrupting her household, and this unorthodox medical treatment rendered her calm, quiet, and obedient once more, few authorities were inclined to ask too many questions about how that transformation had been achieved. The restoration of patriarchal order often took precedence over theological consistency, Ultimately, I believe these treatments had far less to do with genuine healing and far more to do with silencing women. The diagnosis of hysteria was a powerful tool of social control. The idea that a woman's emotional distress came not from her circumstances, but from a malfunctioning organ, allowed those around her to avoid asking difficult and inconvenient questions. They didn't have to ask if she was lonely, trapped in an abusive marriage, grieving, or intellectually stifled. They could simply assume her womb was restless and needed to be physically soothed, transforming a valid response to oppression into a personal, biological failing. This so-called gentle massage existed in a terrifying grey area, blurring the line between healer and abuser, between patient and victim. Women were passed from one healing room to the next, often returning again and again, trapped in a cycle of treatment that left them profoundly confused about whether they were being helped or harmed. There was no established language to describe what was happening to them, no concept of medical consent or bodily autonomy. There were no rules, only the quiet, crushing belief that something inside them was broken and that someone else had the absolute right to fix it by any means necessary. It is almost comical in a deeply unsettling way how swiftly fear could transform into permission. A woman who dared to show strong emotion could be swiftly dismissed as sick. And once she was branded with that label, her body was effectively no longer her own. It became the property of the person holding the cure, a passive object upon which a treatment could be enacted. Whether that cure was delivered by a hand or a tool, the result was the same: the complete subjugation of the female, a raw exercise of power disguised as an act of compassion. Over time, a few women began to find ways to resist this system. Some outright refused the treatment, risking the consequences. Others fled from known healers or confided in midwives they trusted, creating a whispered network of warnings. In certain towns, the word would spread: not every healer was safe, not every touch was meant for healing. But the power imbalance was too vast, and the alternative was too terrifying. The fear of being left untreated, and worse, being officially labelled as insane or possessed, was enough to keep most women quiet and compliant, forcing them to accept the treatment in the desperate hope that, eventually, they would simply be left alone. A few of the instruments from that period still survive today, tucked away in museum collections, though they are rarely labelled for what they truly were. You might see them behind glass, polished wooden rollers, padded handles, strange leather straps. The descriptions are often vague, using terms like medical device or massage tool. Few curators wish to state aloud what these objects were really for. The silence of the women who endured their use still lingers just beneath the polished surface of the glass, a quiet testament to a time when what we now recognize as abuse was once written down on a prescription. After all the rituals of the living, some desperate souls turned their attention to the dead. In the most hidden corners of medieval Europe, where official Christian doctrine mingled with the stubborn remnants of older pagan traditions, whispers circulated of practices that most people would not dare speak of aloud. These rituals were not part of public life, never appearing in sermons or festivals. They were dark, secret knowledge, passed from one desperate person to another in moments of profound fear, grief, and helplessness, often as a last resort when all other hope was lost. Among the strangest and most unsettling of these was the belief that performing an act of sexual intercourse in, or immediately beside a coffin could bestow fertility, good fortune, or a powerful spiritual cleansing. This belief was never mainstream, but it surfaced just often enough to be recorded in the private writings of midwives and healers, and to be condemned in the records of church courts. The underlying logic was a form of sympathetic magic, the idea that life and death existed on a knife's edge, and that by performing an act of creation in the direct presence of decay, the fundamental balance of the cosmos could be shocked back into alignment. The fear of infertility in the medieval world was a powerful and corrosive force. A childless couple, especially after several years of marriage, was often viewed with suspicion, seen as cursed by God or tainted by some hidden sin. The woman, as was typical, shouldered the vast majority of the blame. She was told her womb was cold, her blood was weak, or her prayers were unworthy. When the official remedies, herbal drinks, grueling fasts, and long pilgrimages to the shrines of saints, all failed to produce a child, some couples were directed toward a final, desperate solution: a visit to the grave. For the couples who participated, this was no perverse desecration. It is difficult not to shudder at the image of two people undressing beside the dead, hoping for a new life to begin in the shadow of an ending. But for them, the act was imbued with profound and sacred meaning. It was an attempt to reverse their fate, a ritual designed to force destiny to change its course. It represented the ultimate act of confronting what they feared most: death and finality, in a desperate, last-ditch effort to reclaim what nature and God had seemingly denied them: a child. These grim, nocturnal rituals were rarely performed alone. They were typically overseen by individuals who operated on the fringes of clerical authority. These were the so-called spiritual mediators, or holy interpreters, village cunning folk and healers who preserved a deep well of pre-Christian knowledge. They spoke with an ancient certainty, using phrases that felt sacred and timeless. The timing of the ritual was paramount, carefully chosen to coincide with moments when the veil between the worlds of the living and the dead was believed to be at its thinnest: on the night of a full moon, or on the feast day of a particularly potent martyr, a day already charged with the spiritual energy of death and resurrection. The act itself was conducted with the solemnity of a religious rite. It was intended to be a quiet, focused, and meditative union, entirely stripped of mundane passion. Loud noises, and especially laughter, were strictly forbidden, as they were believed to dishonor the spirits of the dead whose help was being sought. In some regional variations of the ritual, the woman was required to wear a simple white veil, a symbol of purity, while in others, the man had to remain completely silent throughout the entire act. Afterward, the cloth used in their union was often buried near the grave, along with a small offering, a coin for passage, or a piece of bread for sustenance, a final gesture of respect to the spirits whose power they had hoped to borrow. Unsurprisingly, the Church condemned such practices with absolute vehemence. Any ritual that involved interacting with the dead was branded as necromancy, a demonic perversion of sacred Christian rites and a damnable sin. Penitentials from the period list defiling graves as a transgression that required years of harsh penance. Yet, because these acts unfolded in the deepest secrecy, in remote crypts and private family tombs, they were incredibly difficult for the authorities to police. Rumors might spread, but few people were willing to confess their involvement or testify against their neighbors. When someone was caught, the punishment could be severe, but more often than not, the dark secret was simply reburied along with the memory of the desperate act. I believe these chilling rituals ultimately speak more to the profound depths of human fear than to the impulses of human desire. They were not born from a place of lust, but from a desperate and powerful longing for continuity, stability, and a future. In a world where medicine was rudimentary, where infant mortality was crushingly high, and where divine favor felt arbitrary and unpredictable, people reached for any source of power they could find. They were driven by the existential terror of a lineage ending, of a family name turning to dust. The act, however horrifying, was an expression of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. Not all versions of this ritual required the grim presence of a real corpse. In some communities, a safer, more symbolic variation was practiced. An empty coffin, perhaps lined with a few old bones, or even a simple bed constructed in the shape of a tomb, would serve the same ritualistic purpose. The intention was to perform a kind of theatrical reenactment of the same magical logic, to trick fate, by making it believe that death had already been confronted and symbolically overcome. It was a private battle against the curse of barrenness, fought in the most uncomfortable and emotionally charged of settings. but without the added transgression of desecrating a true grave. This belief in the procreative power of the grave faded slowly over the centuries as medical knowledge improved and such folk practices were more aggressively suppressed. But the core idea, the potent link between death and fertility, never completely disappeared. Echoes of it survived in later, gentler rituals. The custom of a childless woman sleeping in a graveyard to dream of her future children, or the practice of placing a pinch of graveyard dirt or a lock of a deceased relative's hair beneath the marriage bed for good luck. The physical intensity was gone, but the haunting and touching connection between the finality of sorrow and the hope for new beginnings remained. After the morbid rituals of the grave, we turn to something far less grim, but no less curious. This next belief involved not bones or tombs, but the most intimate and everyday item of a woman's clothing. In the medieval world, undergarments were more than just a practical layer. They were believed to be a potent canvas for symbols, hopes, and a kind of subtle, personal magic. Among certain groups of women, a peculiar belief took hold that the simple act of flipping one's underwear inside out could amplify one's physical attractiveness, creating an invisible but powerful pull on a man's attention. The logic behind this practice was a form of sympathetic magic, an idea that was simple but strange. It was thought that by wearing her linen undercloth the wrong way around, a woman could effectively trap her own inner heat, her vital life force, holding it closer to her body instead of allowing it to dissipate. This concentrated warmth, when eventually released through touch or even close proximity, was believed to carry her essence and awaken a deep, often subconscious, interest in others. The act was always deliberate, a conscious ritual performed in the morning, often accompanied by a whispered line from a folk verse, turning a simple piece of clothing into a charged magical talisman for the day ahead. Some women, especially those in the competitive world of brothels, developed more elaborate versions of this ritual, employing multiple layers of enchanted underclothing. The first layer might be a simple, well-worn piece of linen. The second layer, however, could be adorned with small charms or intricate stitch patterns, perhaps with a piece of colored thread to signify a specific intention. The final layer, the one worn closest to the skin or just beneath the outer dress, was the one that was reversed. This was the garment meant to actively hold and project desire, and it was often embroidered with potent symbols, knots to bind a lover, hearts for affection, or spirals to enchant the eye. A silent language of magic stitched into the very seams. It is an oddly clever and poignant thought that in a world that afforded women so little genuine power, reversing a piece of fabric could feel like a form of control. This magic cost nothing. It required no expensive ingredients or forbidden texts. It left no visible mark, yet it gave the woman who practiced it a small but significant sense of agency. It was a way for her to feel that she was not merely a passive recipient of fate, but an active participant in shaping her own destiny. In a social landscape where wealth and a public voice were denied to her, an intention stitched into a seam was something real she could hold on to amplify the garment's power. Some women sought to have it blessed, not by a priest, but by a midwife or an older, cunning woman who held an alternative spiritual authority rooted in female wisdom. Others would soak the cloth in herbal water, rose for love, lavender for seduction, and leave it to dry under the light of a full moon, believing it would absorb the moon's mystical energy. A few would go even further, secretly stitching tiny, almost invisible, items into the hem, a lock of their own hair, a thread from a man's cloak, or a fragment of a dried flower, each addition layering a new and more specific intention onto the char. Ultimately, I see this less as a belief in magic and more as a form of silent negotiation with a harsh and uncertain world. The reversed fabric was more than just cloth. It was a physical manifestation of effort, of thought, of a woman's focused will to prepare herself for another day of precarity. The church might preach against such vanities, but a priest's abstract sermon about sin meant little compared to the concrete reality of needing to earn enough coin to eat or to ensure a husband's return. For these women, practical results, however they were achieved, would always outweigh the threat of damnation. Some women took this practice a step further, using the hidden surfaces of the fabric as a secret parchment. They would write small words or symbols on the inside of the garment, using crude ink made from fireplace ashes or crushed berries. The letters would fade quickly with sweat and friction, but while they were fresh, they were believed to carry immense power: a lover's name, a plea for protection, a single word expressing a desperate wish. Others would carry tiny scrolls, no bigger than a finger, tucked into the waistband. These might contain a protective verse, a magical charm, or a copied line from an old prayer, a hidden appeal to a higher power held close against the skin. Like any good magic, this ritual was governed by its own set of mysterious rules. These traditions, varying from town to town, gave the act a sense of weight and seriousness. The charm was believed to lose its power if the garment was removed too quickly or washed before at least 3 days had passed, allowing the woman's essence to fully permeate the cloth. Some believed it worked best if the woman remained mostly silent on the day it was worn, focusing her energy inward. But the most important rule was that if a man ever discovered the secret, the spell would be instantly and irrevocably broken, a condition that reinforced the absolute necessity of secrecy. As strange as the rules governing attraction had become, even more bizarre beliefs were circulating in the back alleys and herbal stalls of medieval towns. While the church taught most people to fear spilled semen as a mortal sin, a different perspective was taking hold on the fringes of society. Among folk healers and traders operating outside the church's authority, semen was beginning to be seen in a new light, not as a symbol of wasted life, but as a potent physical substance, an ingredient with powerful, almost alchemical, healing properties that could be harnessed and consumed. The preparation of this strange medicine was a process shrouded in secrecy. It would begin quietly, with a piece of linen cloth used after an act of intimacy. Instead of being washed or discarded, the cloth would be carefully saved and set out to dry, sometimes pressed between 2 stones or laid on a flat rooftop beneath the sun. Once the fabric was stiff and brittle, the dried substance was meticulously scraped off and ground into a fine powder using a mortar and pestle. This powder was then collected and mixed with other ingredients: strong wine mint and crushed nutmeg for men, rim milk, cinnamon, and dried raspberry leaves for women, creating a remedy tailored to treat specific ailments of vitality and fertility. These unique medicinal mixtures were not sold openly in the bustling city markets. They could only be found on the fringes of commerce, in the outer markets, and at crossroads fairs where the rules were softer and the risks of being caught by the authorities were higher. The healers who sold them never advertised their wares aloud. A prospective customer had to know who to ask and, more importantly, how to ask using coded language to make their request. They might ask for the fire route, to treat impotence, or the salt of men. For a barren wife, the buyers were often shame-faced and mortified, but their desperation to find a cure for their intimate afflictions outweighed their embarrassment. It is difficult not to be taken aback by the idea of consuming a powdered form of another person's bodily fluids. Yet, we must remember that desperation has a powerful way of making the unthinkable seem reasonable. These people were at the end of their rope. When official prayers had gone unanswered, and when sanctioned herbal remedies and baths had failed to bring any change, they turned to what their worldview told them was the most fundamental source of life itself. In the pre-scientific mind, semen was the physical embodiment of the life force, and to them, consuming it was the most direct way to absorb its power. This illicit trade was highly specific. A client believing that the potency of the remedy was tied to the vitality of the donor might secretly request a powder made from the semen of a particular man. Someone in the village renowned for his strength, his virility, or his large brood of healthy children. This created a strange and clandestine market where a man might be paid secretly for his contribution, or where a cloth might be stolen by a prostitute from a brothel after a specific client's visit. While the church seems to have been largely unaware of this practice, its existence is confirmed in the records of confessionals, where penitents would admit to having consumed strange powders, their guilt and anxiety palpable in the scribe's notes. I believe this practice reveals a profound truth about the medieval psyche. When people felt utterly powerless, when they were confronted with life's most painful and intractable problems, they would turn to any ritual or remedy that offered them even the smallest illusion of control. The act of doing something, of seeking out a healer, buying a secret powder, and performing a ritual, was in itself a powerful antidote to the despair of passivity. Whether it was a charm sewn into a hem or a powder hidden in a pouch, the psychological need to take action in the face of suffering often proved stronger than the fear of sin or the revulsion at the remedy itself. The grim logistics of this trade often fell to the women working in brothels, who were paid a meagre fee by the healers to collect the necessary cloths. This task was part of a dark and exploitative economy, where their bodies and their clients were commodified in more ways than one. The exchange was a silent, hurried transaction. A soiled piece of linen passed from the hand of a prostitute to the hand of a healer in a shadowed alleyway. Some women refused, finding the act too strange or too risky, but for many others, it was simply another grim necessity of survival, another small price to pay for a coin, and the promise of making it through another day in a world that offered them few choices. The efficacy of these powdered remedies was, at best, a dangerous gamble. While some people who consumed the concoctions undoubtedly grew ill from the unhygienic nature of the ingredients, stories of success were all that was needed to keep the trade alive. A man might claim his vigor had returned, or a woman might joyfully announce her womb had stirred after years of barren silence. We might now call this the placebo effect, but in an age where faith itself was considered a tangible and powerful force, the sincere belief in the remedy's power was a potent ingredient in its own right. This hope, however slim, was enough to perpetuate the secret practice for centuries. After the private world of powdered potions, we now turn to ancient path where desire was not hidden but put on public display. In some isolated, rural corners of medieval Europe, where the rhythm of the seasons held more sway than the sermons of the church, communities turned to the earth itself for their salvation. Here, the fertility of the land and the fertility of its people were seen as two sides of the same coin. An ancient belief persisted that the act of communal intercourse, performed as a ritual in a newly sown field, could transfer the vital energy of human life directly into the soil, ensuring a bountiful harvest and the survival of the village. This was not the chaotic orgy of a debauched fantasy. It was a solemn and sacred rite, performed with the gravity of a religious ceremony. Entire communities would assemble on a chosen night, often the spring equinox, and walk in a quiet procession to a designated field. There was no loud celebration, only a shared, silent purpose. Participants might wear wreaths of new grass or cover their faces with clay, ritual adornments that separated them from their everyday identities. The act itself was considered an offering, a sacred duty to the land, performed in hushed reverence with the belief that the combined life force of the community would awaken the dormant Eads sleeping in the earth below. The church, unsurprisingly, reacted to these rituals with unmitigated horror. Clergy condemned them as disgusting relics of pagan nature worship, a direct and blasphemous challenge to the authority of God and his priests. From the pulpit, they preached that such behavior was an open invitation to demons, and that the fields consecrated by these acts would be cursed, bringing disease and disaster upon the entire village. But for a peasant community whose very existence depended on the harvest, the immediate, tangible threat of starvation was far more terrifying than the abstract, distant threat of eternal damnation. And so the rituals quietly continued, Despite raids by church officials, public penance, and the threat of excommunication, these traditions proved remarkably resilient. They were not organized acts of political or theological rebellion. They were held together by the fundamental and desperate forces of hunger and habit, and no sermon could easily erase them. The persistence of these rituals reveals a profound truth. They were less about a coherent belief in magic and more about a community's desperate need to do something in the face of utter powerlessness. When official prayers for rain failed and the crops began to wither, people turned to the older, more tangible ways of their ancestor, finding shared hope and a sense of agency in the ancient ritual. As these communal rites faded into memory, we moved from the open fields back into the enclosed, transactional spaces of the towns. In the dimly lit brothels that lined the back streets of medieval cities, a woman's body was a commodity, and its presentation was a matter of professional requirement. When all other methods of seduction failed, or when a madam wished to enforce a certain standard, many women were told to turn to a kind of fire. This was not a literal flame, but a searing concoction of strong liquor, ground ginger, and crushed pepper, a crude and agonizing preparation designed to be applied directly to their most sensitive skin. The practice was a chillingly routine part of life in many of these establishments. A new woman would be shown the mixture, often a gritty paste in a wooden bowl, without much explanation. She would be handed a rag soaked in the concoction and instructed to press it between her legs. The pain was sharp, immediate, and breathtakingly intense. A deep, chemical burn that every woman who had used it before knew all too well. They were not expected to cry out or complain. They were expected to clench their teeth, endure the sting in silence, and get through it. For many, it was not a choice. It was simply part of the job. The twisted justification for this brutal practice was rooted entirely in the perceived preferences and anxieties of male clients. The intense, spicy aroma of the mixture was intended to mask any natural bodily scents, which were considered unappealing, and replace them with an artificial fragrance that men would supposedly mistake for a sign of heightened arousal. Furthermore, it was falsely believed that the concoction acted as an astringent, making the woman's body feel tighter and more responsive. These were unsubstantiated myths, of course, but they were myths that served the desires of the clientele, and in his world, that was the only truth that mattered. The physical damage caused by the repeated application of this caustic mixture was severe and cumulative. A single use might leave angry red welts. Regular use would cause the skin to blister and peel, often leading to raw, open wounds that were highly susceptible to infection in the unhygienic conditions. Over time, some women suffered permanent nerve damage, a loss of sensation that was perversely referred to as either a blessing or a curse. Still, the routine continued. If a man complained of an unpleasant smell, real or imagined, the woman was always blamed and sent back to the washing basin for another painful application. I believe this practice demonstrates, in the most visceral way, how pain could be disguised as professionalism. These women were not given tools to care for themselves or to make their work safer. They were given instructions to inflict harm upon their own bodies, to reshape themselves into a more acceptable product, even if it meant causing lasting injury. The ingredients themselves, common household items like ginger, pepper, and liquor, were twisted into instruments of a strange and intimate torture, a daily ritual of self-harm enforced as a standard of so-called professional conduct. Even within the supposedly safe confines of the home, women sought out secret and powerful forms of influence. One of the most clandestine and feared of these rituals involved an ingredient that was surrounded by both deep taboo and a belief in its immense magical power: menstrual blood. In many parts of Europe, it was whispered that just a few drops of this potent fluid, secretly administered, could bind a man's heart to a woman forever, ensuring his undying loyalty and affection. This was magic at its most transgressive, drawing power from the very substance that religious law deemed impure. The method was a masterpiece of domestic stealth, a ritual woven into the mundane fabric of daily chores. A wife or a lover would collect a few drops of her blood onto a cloth, allow it to dry, and then scrape the dark flakes into her husband's evening meal or stir them into his cup of wine. Never enough to alter the taste or colour, just enough to be swallowed without notice. This was a secret passed down exclusively through the female line, a mother's grim but practical wedding gift to her daughter, often accompanied by strict warnings: never tell a soul, never use it in anger, and always cleanse the bowl. The magical logic behind this act was a form of potent sympathetic magic. It was believed that menstrual blood carried the very essence of a woman's procreative power and her personal will. By having a man ingest this part of her, she was creating a permanent, unbreakable bond. His body would now contain a part of hers, and therefore his thoughts, his desires, and his loyalties would be inexorably drawn back to her. It was said that a man who had consumed his wife's blood would forget the scent of other women and be physically unable to stray from the marital bed. It was a loyalty trap served with a smile. Even in the most sacred of spaces, the convent, the policing of desire took on cruel and corporeal forms. Beneath the written rules governing prayer and piety, there existed a set of quieter, unwritten punishments reserved for women who were deemed too expressive, too curious, or simply too full of life. These nuns were often labelled as being consumed by lust, even if their supposed sin was nothing more than a lingering blush or an inappropriately joyful laugh. For these women, discipline came not in the form of extra prayers, but in the agonizing application of fire hidden in stone. The method was as simple as it was chilling. A large, flat stone, often taken from the hearth of the convent's kitchen, was heated in the fire until its surface glowed with a dangerous heat. The accused nun would be stripped to her shift and made to lie flat on her back on the cold floor. The nun in charge of discipline would then take the heated stone and place it directly on the woman's bare stomach, a weight of burning agony placed squarely over the physical center of female desire and fertility. There were no straps or bindings. The searing, unescapable pain was enough to hold her in place as she clenched her teeth and endured the ordeal in silence. It is a horrifying irony that in order to purge a woman of her perceived inner fire, her superiors would resort to an act of such intimate and violating heat. The slow, deep burn of the stone was meant not only to wound the body, but to crush the spirit, to teach a woman to fear her own warmth. The bizarre logic behind this ritual was rooted in humoral theory. Lust was seen as a kind of internal fever, an excess of hot humors in the body. The solution, in their minds, was to fight fire with fire, to use the intense external heat of the stone to draw the sinful, internal heat out of the woman's body, thereby restoring her to a more spiritual state of old, dry purity. In some corners of medieval society, when a woman's chastity was called into question, the matter was settled not with evidence or testimony, but with a terrifying appeal to divine intervention known as the trial by ordeal. This crude and brutal ritual was based on a simple and unshakable belief: if a woman was truly innocent, then God himself would perform a miracle to protect her from harm. The test involved placing an iron blade into a fire until it glowed a dangerous, incandescent red. The woman would then be forced to hold the blade in her bare hands or have it pressed against her skin. If she was burned, she was guilty. If she was not, she was pure. When infidelity disrupted the social fabric of a community, the response was often not quiet discretion but loud, ritualized humiliation. The punishments for adultery were designed to be public spectacles, cruel street theatre that served as a vivid warning to others. A man caught in the act might be paraded through the town with a metal ring locked around his genitals, from which small bells were hung. With every agonizing step he took, the jingling bells would announce his sin to the entire village. Women faced a different, more insidious form of torture. They were often forced to wear undergarments made of coarse horsehair or sharp thistles, an invisible punishment that caused constant itching and burning against their skin, a private agony to match their private crime. Even the smallest gestures were laden with profound spiritual meaning in the medieval world, and no part of the body was more suspect than the left hand. It was called unclean, the devil's hand, and was associated with dark forces and deception. This deep-seated superstition crept into every aspect of life, but it carried a special weight within the intimacy of the marital bed. It was considered inappropriate, and in some devout regions, actively sinful, for a husband to touch his wife with his left hand during their relations. The right hand was for blessings and holy gestures. The left, it was believed, could introduce a corrupting, profane influence into an act that was meant to be sacred